Hey friends, tonight we're venturing into the part of history most books politely avoid. Just how bad people really smelled in the Middle Ages. And I don't mean a little sweaty after work bad. I mean no soap, no toilet paper, no clean underwear, no deodorant kind of bad. Bathing, maybe once a season, if you were lucky. Toilets, basically holes in wood. And some folks believe too much bathing could literally kill you. So yeah, if you've ever grumbled about a dirty bathroom at a gas station, just wait till you hear what medieval peasants lived with every single day. Before we wade into the filth, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? It's wild seeing how far this tribe of sleepy, slightly twisted history nerds reaches. And hey, if this episode makes you even 5% more grateful for hot water and toothpaste, hit like, tap, subscribe, or just stay with me to the end. That's more than enough. I'm glad you're here. So now dim the lights, take a breath, but maybe not too deep, and step back in time to an era where everyone smelled terrible and no one thought it was weird. You settle into your straw mattress, worn thin by years of use, the sharp ends poking through the linen sack. It smells faintly of dust, smoke, and something else. Something you can't name but have always known. You shift slightly, trying to get comfortable, but your neck itches. So does your shoulder, then your thigh. You scratch absently without thinking, because this is how it's always been. Everyone itches, everyone scratches, this is life. In the Middle Ages, parasites were not occasional pests but ever-present companions. There was no escaping them. They lived in your clothes, your bed, your hair, your seams. They scuttled across your skin in the dead of night and nestled in the soft creases of your body during the day. Lice, fleas and mites had colonized humanity, and few could do anything about it. Most didn't even try. Bathing was uncommon, not just because water was cold or scarce, but because people believed it was dangerous. Many thought that opening the pores through warm water made one vulnerable to disease. Bathhouses, once common in earlier centuries, had declined by the high medieval period, and in some places were even shut down as hubs of vice and immorality. For the average person, cleanliness meant changing your underclothes if you had them, or rubbing your skin with a cloth. Even that was rare. The layer of filth was paradoxically seen by some as protective. Removing it could do more harm than good, they believed. Better to live with the bugs than risk a fever. Most peasants owned one set of clothing, perhaps a second if they were lucky or serving in a wealthier household. These garments were rarely washed and even more rarely boiled. Washing was reserved for days of religious significance or major life events. The fabrics were coarse, mostly wool, and difficult to clean. But it wasn't just about convenience, it was about survival. Wool shrank, linen frayed, water was cold, soap was precious, fires needed fuel. There were more pressing concerns like eating and praying and avoiding punishment from the local bailiff. Scratching then was a lesser nuisance. At night, families huddled together for warmth. Whole households, including the animals in poorer homes, shared a single room. The straw pallets were often never fully replaced, just added to, layered like sediment. With each passing season, the layers teemed with more life. Fleas loved straw. They thrived in it. The warmth of human bodies, especially packed closely together, gave them all they needed to multiply. Even those of higher rank were not immune. Nobles had servants to maintain their beds and clothes, but those servants also carried lice. Castles and manors might have finer fabrics, but they also had heavy drapes, dense mattresses stuffed with feathers, and thick rugs, all of which became havens for pests. The richer the household, the more material for bugs to infest. Comfort, in this sense, came with its own cost, and yet lice were not universally loathed. Disliked, yes, but not stigmatized in the way they are today. Their presence was a part of life. Some even found comfort in rituals of delousing, a mother gently picking nits from her daughter's scalp, a wife tending to her husband's collar, the faint soft pop of a louse crushed between thumbnails. It was intimate, familial, a daily act of care as common as breaking bread. Monks cloistered from the world fared no better. Their shaved crowns offered no protection. Their habits were worn constantly, rarely cleaned. Insects nestled into the folds and seams, taking root in the lives of men devoted to spiritual cleanliness. There were debates in religious texts about whether killing lice on the Sabbath was a sin. Some said yes, it was a form of labour. Others argued it was a necessary mercy. Either way, the presence of lice was viewed at times as a divine reminder of humility, that no man, no matter how holy, could escape the discomfort of the flesh. The Black Death made fleas infamous. When plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, killing tens of millions. The true cause wasn't fully understood, but there were whispers, observations. Rats died first and then people, and fleas were always there. Those who could burned their clothes and bedding. Cities ordered homes to be cleaned, straw to be removed, even entire districts to be razed. But it was too late. The fleas had already moved on. The plague was more than a disease. It was a fear, a silence, a smell in the streets, and it had travelled by hitching a ride on the smallest, most ordinary of creatures. People tried everything to rid themselves of their crawling burdens. Combs with tightly spaced teeth made of wood, ivory, or metal were cherished possessions. Vinegar was applied to hair, garlic rubbed on the skin, some turned to charms, tiny scrolls of parchment with holy words, worn under clothing. Others wore flowers or herbs, not just for the smell, but in the hope that they would repel unwanted guests. But these were weak defences, temporary, a drop of oil in a bucket of infestation. Itching became a way of life. Children invented games involving the capture and destruction of lice. Adults scratched until they bled. Skin infections were common, as were strange growths and sores, but without modern terminology, these were simply part of the human condition. Doctors offered treatments based on the balance of humours. They might prescribe bleeding or purging, or recommend a poultice made of crushed herbs and wine. It rarely worked. Still, something was better than nothing. And yet, remarkably, life went on. People married, sang, tilled fields, and raised children under this invisible siege. The bugs became background noise, just another thing to endure. In a world filled with war, famine, and uncertainty, lice were oddly dependable. Always there, always biting. Even in art and literature, they made their appearances. Writers like Chaucer, observing pilgrims on their journey, mentioned their lice and the constant scratching. Court painters captured the awkward hand reaching behind a collar, the subtle gesture of discomfort made permanent in oil. When you consider this, you begin to see how distant we are from the past, not just in technology or medicine, but in what we expect from daily life. Cleanliness, comfort, privacy, these are modern luxuries. For much of history, people lived in their bodies differently. They expected pain, expected filth, expected to scratch and not be rid of the cause. Still, the question lingers. Did they ever imagine a world where the itch could be cured? Where a bath was safe, a bed was clean, and a scalp didn't crawl? Or did they simply accept it, never daring to dream of the impossible? Perhaps in the quiet moments, just before sleep, as the last candle guttered out and the scratching subsided, they did. Perhaps they wondered if the itch would ever leave, and what kind of world would exist if it did. The itch didn't always begin immediately. Sometimes it arrived slowly, like the creeping realization of something not quite right. A crawling sensation just under the edge of a sleeve, a single bite behind the ear. But once it began, it rarely ended. It spread. It multiplied. The body became a territory constantly under siege. And what a perfect battlefield the medieval body was. Clothing that never met soap, skin seldom scrubbed, and homes warmed by open hearths rather than enclosed stoves, all created an ecosystem ideal for pests. Lice and fleas were not just part of the landscape, they were inhabitants of a shared biome, moving freely from person to person, bed to bed, and even from animals to humans. In this time before microscopes and germ theory, there was no understanding of the microscopic world. What couldn't be seen was often blamed on miasma, bad humours, or sin. But what could be seen, like lice, was tolerated out of resignation. Their presence was not a moral failing. It was a social equaliser. A peasant and a priest could scratch the same way. A nun and a farm girl might exchange knowing glances as they picked nits in the midday sun. It was normal, not desirable, just normal. Yet behind that normalisation was quiet suffering. In villages where doctors were rare and midwives did double duty as healers, those suffering from intense infestations had few places to turn. Children particularly bore the brunt of this. Their thin hair and close proximity to siblings made them perfect hosts. They scratched until their scalps wept, the skin beneath breaking open and crusting over. In some cases, scratching led to serious infections, abscesses, fevers, and long-term disfigurement. Parents did what they could. Sometimes they heated vinegar and dabbed it on the heads of their children. Others shaved heads entirely, though this was usually reserved for boys or monks. For girls, whose long hair was a symbol of modesty and beauty, this wasn't an option. Instead, mothers would sit their daughters down and slowly part their hair with a comb, metal if they were wealthy, bone or wood if not, inspecting every inch. The cracking sound of knits being crushed was unmistakable. In the cities, the problem multiplied. More people meant more bodies, more warmth, and more opportunity for fleas to feed and breed. Urban poor lived packed together, often 6 to a room, sometimes more. They shared bedding, clothes, tools, and even lice. The stone streets teemed with refuse, and rats darted through alleyways, sharing fleas with the human population. In these teeming quarters, infestations were not just common, they were inevitable. The wealthier classes too found themselves host to uninvited guests. Ladies in waiting often spent hours tending to their noble mistress's hair, not just styling it, but cleaning it of lice. Wigs, a fashionable necessity in some courts, were filled with vermin despite regular powdering. Powders made from crushed herbs, chalk, or even shallow mercury were applied in the hopes of masking the smell and deterring pests. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. Mercury itself became a remedy of choice in some cases. It was applied to the scalp to kill lice and their eggs, but it was toxic even then. People knew it was dangerous, but when faced with the maddening itch of infestation, danger seemed a reasonable trade. In time, those who used it often grew sick from the inside out. Their skin broke down, their minds faltered, but the lice were gone, at least for a while. In monasteries, the struggle was quieter but no less intense. The vow of cleanliness extended to the soul, not the body. Monks who spent their days copying manuscripts did so under dim candlelight, in thick robes that concealed colonies of lice. The silence of the scriptorium was occasionally broken by the soft scraping of nails on skin, or the slow, deliberate scratch under a collar. Complaints were rare. Pain was a given. It brought humility. Suffering was seen as a form of closeness to the divine. Delousing, though mundane, even featured in rules for monastic life. Some orders allowed time for washing clothes and bedding every few months. Others forbade it entirely, encouraging the monks to embrace discomfort. They were told to ignore the crawling sensations as they would a passing temptation. But ignoring it didn't stop it. The bugs continued. Physicians of the era, educated in ancient texts more than direct observation, often misunderstood the nature of parasites. Many believed lice spontaneously generated from sweat or unclean flesh. A dirty person, they reasoned, would naturally grow lice as fruit grows on a tree. The solution was not killing the lice, but correcting the humours that caused them to appear. Bloodletting, laxatives, or changes in diet were prescribed not to treat the lice, but the person. Yet there were those who noticed patterns. Soldiers returning from long campaigns brought infestations home. Households that slept above stables, warm from the breath of animals, had more trouble with pests. Bakers, whose rooms were closest to ovens, often complained of bites. The warmth, the heat, it attracted more than just tired bodies. It attracted life. Sometimes the bugs weren't even visible. Scabies mites, nearly microscopic, burrowed into the skin. They laid eggs under the surface, creating unbearable itching, red inflamed tracks. Without magnification, these signs were mysterious and deeply feared. Entire families could be infected and never know how or why. Doctors might blame it on witchcraft. Priests might blame it on sin. There was no public health system, no standard for cleanliness, no universally accepted method for eradication. In places where communities took the matter into their own hands, there were periodic burnings of clothes and bedding. These events, usually triggered by rumours of plague or divine punishment, were acts of desperation. People would gather their possessions, throw them onto large fires, and watch as the smoke carried their pests away, if only temporarily. Still, most simply endured. It was easier. The cost of clothing was too high, Baths were too dangerous. Comb teeth broke easily. Children cried when their heads were scrubbed with vinegar, and so people lived with it. Day after day, year after year, a kind of quiet endurance formed, an almost philosophical resignation. This was the way things were, the way they had always been, and yet one wonders what happened in the private moments, when the candles were snuffed out and the house fell quiet, when the fire burned low and the night air crept in. Did people lie awake, scratching and thinking? Did they pray for relief, not from sin or hunger, but from the simple, maddening torment of their own skin? Did they wonder, even briefly, if it was possible to be free? In time, the lice were given names, not individual ones of course, but categories. Body lice, head lice, crab lice. They weren't modern distinctions, but folk taxonomies, passed from mouth to mouth in muddy villages and candlelit halls. People knew where each kind lived, what they liked, what they avoided. The lice on the head could be combed out sometimes. The ones in clothing were harder. The ones that found their way below the belt, well, they were seldom spoken of, even when everyone knew they were there. In marriage, lice became part of the dowry no one talked about. A man marrying a woman might bring with him a cloak full of pests. A woman marrying a man might carry them in the lining of her sleeves. Bedding was shared, clothing was shared. So too were infestations. The first weeks of marriage may have been marked not by romance, but by new, unfamiliar itches. A transfer of colony to colony, flesh to flesh. In some regions, louse catchers became a profession. Not officially, of course. No one put it on a sign or carved it into wood. But the old women who knew how to spot them, to squeeze them just right between hardened thumbnails, became valuable in close-knit communities. Children lined up for the service, hair parted, heads tilted toward the sun, the elder woman peering in, muttering under her breath. Sometimes she'd sing to calm the child, as if lullabies could distract from the clicking of dying insects. It was humiliating, yes, but it was also care. Over time, attitudes toward cleanliness began to shift slowly, unevenly, and not always in the direction we might expect. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, interest in personal hygiene began to re-emerge in certain quarters. Courtly manuals advised noblewomen to wash their faces and hands more frequently. Perfumes, once used to mask rot and decay, began to carry associations of status and elegance, but still, the bugs lingered. Powder and scent could not kill them. They simply adapted. They thrived. Washing returned in some places, but not as a regular practice. Rather, it appeared as a cure, prescribed in moments of crisis. A bride might be washed before her wedding, a child before a feast day, a nobleman on his deathbed. But the bath, though symbolic, rarely meant much. One wash could not undo years of living alongside vermin. The water was often cold, the soap was rough, the tub shared, and afterward, the same unwashed garments went back onto the skin. The same bed was laid upon. The lice waited, patiently. For those who travelled, pilgrims, peddlers, journeymen, the risk of infestation was both accepted and feared. Roadside inns were notorious for their filth, not just the lice, but the straw, the rats, the fleas. Yet few could afford the luxury of clean quarters. Pilgrims, in particular, were often filthy upon arrival at holy sites. Their hair matted, their cloaks stiff with sweat, their skin raw from sun and wool. They scratched their prayers into the dust of the chapel floor, hoping for spiritual absolution, even as they were physically tormented. The church, for its part, offered little guidance on hygiene beyond the spiritual. While some orders, particularly the Benedictines, practiced occasional bathing and laundered their robes every few months, others embraced filth as a sign of holiness. St. Thomas Becket was said to wear a hair shirt so infested with lice that it never stopped moving. Stories like these were told with reverence, a sign of endurance, a test of devotion. Cleanliness to some was pride, dirt, humility. By the early modern period, as cities expanded and trade routes grew thicker, the infestation problem only worsened. New fabrics brought from the east, silks and velvets, were no match for the resilience of European parasites. The dense fibres became cosy nests, the fleas and lice simply adjusted. Even the wealthiest merchant, wrapped in brocade and surrounded by luxury, still scratched himself in the middle of a banquet. Medical knowledge slowly evolved. By the 16th century, the microscope began to change the way people saw the world, though it would take generations before it transformed how they lived. The tiny organisms, once invisible, now had names, shapes, patterns, but naming something doesn't banish it. Even as understanding grew, control lagged behind. The itch persisted. In art, the discomfort became almost comical. Woodcuts depicted peasants crouching over chamber pots, scratching as they relieved themselves. In literature, parasites were used as metaphors for greed, for lust, for the inescapable nature of suffering. Yet beneath the satire was truth. Everyone itched, everyone scratched, everyone bled. And so we find ourselves centuries later in sterile rooms and hot showers, looking back through the centuries. It is hard to imagine a world where daily life was defined by discomfort. Harder still to imagine accepting it. But history does not ask for our comfort. It offers understanding. And the history of parasites is a quiet reminder of how much we take for granted. Today we speak of hygiene as a habit, a duty, even a moral good. But for most of human history it was a fantasy, an aspiration too costly, too complex, too distant. The people of the past lived in their skin in ways we no longer do. They endured it, they managed it. They learned to find moments of care in rituals of delousing, in the pop of a nit between fingernails, in the shared silence of scratching in the dark. And maybe, in some strange way, that shared suffering brought people together. Not just in villages and homes, but across time. You scratch, they scratched. You endure, they endured. The difference is only in the expectation. But there is one lingering thought, a question that history never quite answers. When the first person lay down in a clean bed, bathed, brushed, and free from pests, did they notice the absence? Did they sleep differently, deeper? Or had the body grown so used to the itch, so trained to expect it, that silence felt foreign? Was peace at last uncomfortable? Long before the comforting sound of a modern flush echoed behind closed bathroom doors, waste had to go somewhere, and it didn't vanish quietly. In the world before plumbing, managing the most basic human function was a complex daily task, not a private moment, but a shared, noisy, often foul-smelling part of communal life. And at the heart of this system stood two humble but essential objects, the chamber pot and the hands that emptied it. You wake before dawn. The light outside hasn't yet turned grey. Somewhere a rooster is making a half-hearted attempt at greeting the day. The straw under your bedding crinkles when you move. Your body aches in that usual way. Nothing dramatic, just the accumulated fatigue of everyday life. But the pressing issue is not your back or your hunger. It's the same question that greets you each morning. Where will you go to relieve yourself? In wealthier households, the answer was simple, at least in theory. A chamber pot, usually made of earthenware or pewter, sat under the bed or beside a stool designed to conceal it. You would use it discreetly, wipe with a scrap of cloth or hay, and return the lid if there was one. In the morning, a servant would remove it, holding it at arm's length, and dump the contents into a designated pit or out into the street. But if you weren't among the privileged few who had servants, that task fell to you. Even in a manner, the distinction between elegance and filth was a matter of who handled the dirty work, not whether it existed at all. The chamber pot was ubiquitous, found in palaces, inns and peasant huts. It was one of the few cross-class objects of daily necessity. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't taboo, it was just there. Every household had one, sometimes more. Its presence in a room wasn't cause for embarrassment. In fact, chamber pots were often decorated. Some had painted scenes, flowers, animals, even humorous messages written around the rim. A few were shaped to resemble faces, mouths agape in an eternal gasp, as if reacting to what would inevitably be deposited inside. But while the pot might have had a little charm, its use never did. Most people shared one between several members of the household. Children might be asked to empty it. Older siblings were taught how to aim into it without spilling, especially in the dark. Women, restricted by layers of clothing and tight domestic spaces, often used theirs with careful balance, especially at night when the need was urgent and the path outside too dangerous to navigate in slippers. In urban areas, space was tight and privacy tighter. Families crowded into single rooms. Walls were thin, sounds carried. The act of relieving oneself was neither hidden nor sanitized. A grunt, a splash, a sigh. It was all just part of the background music of daily life. If there was shame, it was rarely mentioned. Not because people were braver or coarser, but because the work of survival left little room for modesty. During the day, chamber pots were often tucked into corners or beneath chairs, cleverly hidden in carved compartments. Some wealthier homes had designated close stools, early furniture with lids that opened to reveal a pot inside, cushioned and draped to match the room's decor. It was still a pot, but dressed up in fabric and pretense. One could sit upon it while reading a psalter or hearing gossip from a maid. Still, someone had to empty it. That task fell to servants, and in the broader ecosystem of human waste, to professionals known as night soil men. They came by many names: gong farmers in Tudor England, fossers in parts of Europe, or simply the collectors. Their work was simple in description, but almost heroic in execution. Under the cover of night, hence their name, they moved through alleys, courtyards and streets, collecting the waste that others wanted gone but never dared confront. These men carried buckets, spades and lanterns. Some pushed carts, others led donkeys burdened with barrels. They wore clothes that were stiff with layers of dried refuse, and they moved with the steady practice pace of those who know their work is necessary but never appreciated. Few people spoke to them. Fewer still looked them in the eye. To do so was to acknowledge that your own filth had a face. Despite their social invisibility, night soil men were essential. In cities without sewers, they were the thin line between order and rot. They emptied cesspits, deep stone-lined holes dug beneath privies or in backyards, that filled slowly with the waste of entire households. These pits needed emptying every few years. When they did, the task was nightmarish. The men descended into the darkness with ropes and buckets, sometimes knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep in fermenting sludge. The smell, it was said, clung to their skin for days. But the job paid well, better than most manual labour. It had to. No one took it for pride. The waste they gathered didn't go to waste. It was dumped outside city walls where it was eventually used as fertiliser. Entire hills formed from the accumulation. In some cases, farmers paid for access. In others, city authorities orchestrated its removal like clockwork, afraid that a delay could trigger not just complaints but disease. Because when the waste piled up too long, it didn't just smell, it spread sickness. Chamber pots weren't limited to homes. In inns and taverns, guests might relieve themselves behind curtains or in communal latrine rooms. Pots were placed along corridors, in alcoves, or even in closets repurposed as privy rooms. The owners had little choice but to deal with the result. Some hired boys to collect and dump the contents regularly. Others simply left the doors open, hoping the draft would carry the stench elsewhere. Of course, not everyone had access to a pot. The poorest used ditches, riversides, or designated midden heaps. In desperate moments, a dark alley would do. And sometimes, when no better option was available, people simply opened their windows and dumped the contents of their pots directly into the street. A warning shout, a quick toss, and the waste hit the cobblestones with a wet slap. It was common enough that city ordinances were passed to prohibit it. Some towns even required households to shout specific phrases like "Garde-à-lou" before throwing to warn passers-by. Whether people obeyed depended more on the time of night than the risk of a fine. The consequences of poor waste management were not abstract. Outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and typhoid ravaged cities throughout the centuries. And yet, despite the risks, the system persisted. The chamber pot remained a fixture for generations, its quiet presence under beds and chairs, a reminder of the body's inescapable needs. But the story of the chamber pot is not just one of inconvenience, it's a story of adaptation, of how societies, without the aid of engineering or modern science, created networks of labour and ritual around the simple act of relieving oneself. The pot was a symbol not of shame, but of cooperation. A household relied on it. A servant cleaned it. A labourer hauled it away. A farmer used its contents to grow crops that would feed the same people again. The cycle, though unsightly, was complete. Still, one wonders, in a world where waste was never truly hidden, where the sound and smell of it permeated daily life, did people become more aware of their shared humanity? Or did they simply learn to turn their noses away, pretending that the pot beneath the bed didn't exist? You walk across the wooden floor of your home and the boards creak softly beneath your feet. You don't think much of it. Perhaps it's the way the wood has settled, the shifting of old beams under cold air. But in many homes of the late medieval and early modern world, the sound of floorboards could carry another truth, the weight of what had been stored beneath them. Not gold, not food, but waste. In many towns and cities where land was limited and privacy even more so, household latrines took the form of small wooden enclosures built over deep pits. These were dug out in yards or alley corners when possible, but in some buildings, especially multi-storey tenements in growing cities, it was not unusual to build a bench with a hole in it above a wooden box or pit. These makeshift closets collected waste from entire households, slowly, silently, steadily, until someone was paid or forced to remove the contents. Until then, it festered. The space beneath a building was often damp and cool. In theory, that helped with the smell. In practice, it merely slowed decomposition. The pit would fill, not just with excrement, but with whatever else was discarded into it: kitchen scraps, animal remains, spoiled milk, broken pottery. It all mixed into a heavy, clinging sludge that locals referred to with words less refined than we use today. And when it needed emptying, the task fell once again to the lowest on the social ladder. The night soil men, those anonymous labourers of the urban ecosystem, had to enter homes through rear alleys, creeping quietly so as not to disturb respectable folk. They dug under buildings, often laying on their bellies to reach narrow space. When pits were too deep to access from above, they climbed down ladders and scooped the waste out bucket by bucket. In certain cities like London, Edinburgh and Paris, these men were issued licenses, more for tracking than for prestige. Their work was essential but unwanted. When they were seen in daylight, they were shunned. Their odour lingered long after they had gone. Their coin was accepted without thanks. Yet their work prevented worse. Cesspits that went unemptied could collapse, the weight of decades pushing against the fragile architecture of medieval homes. Records exist of buildings caving in under the strain of their own waste. Streets that cracked open unexpectedly. In some cases, the collapse was slow. Walls bowed, ceilings tilted, and furniture slid from place to place. But in others, it was sudden. A midnight crash, a family swallowed by their own floor. Death, not from fire or sword, but from rot. In rural areas, the matter was simpler. A wooden outhouse stood behind the cottage, often beside the pig pen. Some villagers practiced bucket and chuck-it methods, carrying pails to a far field or dumping the contents of privies into designated ditches. These too filled in time. When they did, they were covered with soil and forgotten, until someone built over them and the scent returned. Children were taught to avoid these areas. Falling into a pit was not only humiliating, it could be fatal. The thick consistency of the waste made it difficult to escape. More than one medieval story, some real, others apocryphal, involved a drunkard stumbling into a latrine pit and never climbing out. Even the living avoided close contact. Skin infections, boils, and intestinal diseases were common among those who handled the waste, and yet they did, day after day. Not all cities were content with this chaos. Over time, regulations appeared. In parts of Europe, laws were passed requiring cesspits to be lined with stone, their locations registered with local authorities. In places where officials feared disease, especially after the waves of plague, attempts were made to coordinate waste collection. Some towns employed municipal gong farmers and paid them out of public funds. Others allowed private contractors to compete, a rudimentary sanitation market that ran on the margins of legality and taste. The waste itself gained a new name, night soil. Its value became more apparent as agriculture expanded. Farmers learned that when composted with straw and allowed to rest, the material made rich fertilizer. Crops grown in these treated fields flourished. In Japan and China, the collection and use of human waste was elevated into a carefully organized economy centuries before Europe caught up. In those cultures, it wasn't merely tolerated, it was regulated, sold, and even taxed. But in the medieval and early modern West, the system remained informal, often corrupt, and almost always unpleasant. Cities smelled. There's no more polite way to describe it. The smell was layered: horse manure, animal carcasses, tanneries, human refuse. Rain stirred it up, heat made it rise. In narrow alleys, the stench could bring tears to the eyes. Visitors from distant lands often remarked on it, writing in travel journals about the scent of a European city before it even appeared on the horizon. But the locals had grown used to it. Their noses adapted. Complaints were rare, unless the wind changed. As time passed, inventions emerged. In the 16th century, rudimentary flushing toilets were conceived by thinkers like Sir John Harrington, godson to Queen Elizabeth I. His design was elegant, but too expensive and impractical for widespread use. Pipes required pressure, water was needed, and most homes lacked the structural design to support them. The chamber pot endured. Its simplicity was its strength. No plumbing, no construction, no invention, just a container and a task. Children were potty trained early, not for reasons of cleanliness, but because pots were communal and mistakes were messy. The family routine revolved around their use. Parents awoke first and emptied the pot. Elderly relatives were helped to it in the middle of the night. Servants, if present, were expected to maintain it without question. Some pots were passed down through generations, prized for their craftsmanship or sentimental value. Others were replaced regularly, chipped from overuse or broken during frantic midnight scrambles. When a guest arrived, they were told where the pot was kept. There was no shame in asking, no need to be discreet. The human need was universal, and the response, though primitive, was practical. In public spaces, the management of waste became more difficult. Markets, fairs, and public gatherings often lacked proper facilities. Temporary latrines were dug, filled, and abandoned. Privy corners emerged, known spots behind buildings where people could relieve themselves quickly. These became hazards for the unlucky and the unaware. One step too far in the wrong direction, and a shoe was lost. Or worse, the problem extended beyond odour and mess. Disease spread. Typhoid spread through contaminated water was common. So was dysentery. Clean drinking water was hard to find, and many streams ran downstream from human activity. Wells were dug too close to latrines. Animals drank from the same water sources. And still, people coped. They boiled when they could, prayed when they couldn't. It was not ideal, but it worked most of the time. And so the pot beneath the bed remained. Its presence, humble and constant, shaped the rhythm of daily life. A child's morning chore, a servant's burden, a labourer's load. An object as ordinary as the hearth and just as central. Its removal marked the start of the day. Its return marked the quiet approach of night. Still, one wonders, did anyone ever pause, while lifting the lid or wiping the rim or watching a night soil man disappear down the alley, and think, is this really the best we can do? Is there a cleaner way, a quieter way, a way that doesn't require turning our faces from our own reflection in a bucket of waste? The pot sat in the same place it always had, tucked beneath a wooden stool or stored under the bed. It had no moving parts. It didn't require repairs or special tools. It didn't make noise, it simply waited. Morning or midnight, summer or winter, it was there, always waiting. Years passed and still the pot remained. Whole lifetimes unfolded around it. Children were born in the same rooms where it sat, meals were eaten, songs were sung, prayers whispered, and still it remained, a silent companion to every rhythm of life. For centuries, the idea of disposing of waste through anything other than buckets, barrels, or a man with a shovel was simply beyond imagination. The concept of flushing something away to a place unseen was not just futuristic, it was absurd. The earliest attempts at plumbing were limited to the elite. In some Roman homes, long before the medieval world reigned, there were indoor latrines that flowed with water into sewers. But these innovations vanished with the empire, and for nearly a millennium, cities across Europe returned to simpler, older methods. By the time chamber pots came to dominate daily life again, the notion of waterborne sanitation had become little more than a distant echo. When Sir John Harrington's flush toilet appeared in the late 16th century, it caused some interest but very little adoption. His design required an upstairs cistern, lead piping, and a considerable supply of clean water, all luxuries few households possessed. Queen Elizabeth I, his godmother, reportedly approved of the idea but never used it regularly. Like many great inventions, it was ahead of its time, so the pot stayed. But while pots remained static, cities changed. They grew larger, denser, louder. The problems of sanitation grew with them. In places like Paris, London, and Edinburgh, the limits of the chamber pot system were becoming harder to ignore. Rain no longer washed the filth away fast enough. The rivers reeked. Wells grew foul. Typhoid struck regularly. And cholera made its arrival in the early 19th century like an unwelcome guest no one could evict. The old methods were no longer just unpleasant. They were deadly. By this time, the labour of night soil men had reached its limit. Their numbers couldn't keep up with the waste produced by the expanding population. The cesspits were dug deeper. The wagons ran more frequently, but the streets still stank. Complaints multiplied, so did the illnesses. And under growing pressure, reformers began to emerge, not just as theorists, but as engineers, doctors, and architects of a cleaner future. In the mid-1800s, public health pioneers like Edwin Chadwick in Britain began to push for infrastructure that would remove waste not just from homes, but from the city itself. Chadwick's famous report on sanitary conditions exposed the horrific consequences of urban filth in painstaking, measured language. He spoke not of morals, but of mortality rates, not of shame, but of cholera. His work, and that of others like him, began to shift the conversation. Soon after, cities began to invest in underground sewer networks. The idea was not new, but now it gained traction. In London, Joseph Bazalgette's massive engineering project laid out a system of brick tunnels beneath the city, miles and miles of them, designed to carry waste away from homes and into treatment facilities. For the first time, a city truly tried to carry its waste out of sight and out of smell. The chamber pot, once a fixture in every household, began its slow retreat. First in wealthier homes, replaced by water closets, ceramic bowls connected to cisterns and pipes. Then gradually in boarding houses, inns, and urban apartments. It took time, decades in fact, but as the convenience of the flush toilet spread, the pot fell silent. Even so, many homes clung to their pots long after sewers were laid. Water supplies were inconsistent, pipes froze in winter, toilets clogged, but the pot was dependable. You could carry it, empty it, hide it, trust it. Some households kept one under the bed as a backup for years, just in case. They were cleaned, stored, and sometimes forgotten. Rediscovered in attics, basements, and barns decades later. Stained, cracked, but intact. A relic of a time when sanitation was a personal burden, not a civic service. As for the night soil men, their role vanished with barely a word. Their profession faded as the pipes replaced the bucket. The carts stopped coming, the alleyways quieted. Some of these men found work in new municipal sanitation departments. Street sweepers, sewer inspectors, pipe fitters. Others disappeared into obscurity, their trade too filthy to be remembered fondly, too essential to be properly honoured. And yet their work laid the foundation for everything that followed. Without their daily, thankless labour, cities would have collapsed under their own filth. Their routes, though rarely mapped, formed the first waste management networks. They knew the city by its smells, by its rot, by the weight of what no one else would carry. Their knowledge, where the pits lay deepest, where the soil was too soft, where the stink was strongest, was passed from one worker to the next orally, like a guild without prestige. When the modern sewer came, it followed their steps. Today, few give thought to what happens after the flush. The noise, the movement, the swirl of water. It feels final, disappearing as if by magic. But the infrastructure beneath our cities is vast, noisy, and alive with motion. Pumps, pipes, tanks, treatment plants. What was once hauled by hand is now managed by machines and monitored by sensors. The labour continues, but it is cleaner, quieter, and hidden from view. The chamber pot, once a humble centrepiece of domestic life, is now a curiosity. Museums display them behind glass, some with humorous slogans painted around the rim, others elegant, delicate, surprisingly beautiful. Few who pass by understand their importance. Fewer still imagine life without their modern replacement. But every time a child flushes a toilet, every time a street remains dry after a storm, every time a city avoids a health crisis, it owes a small silent debt to the centuries when people carried their waste in pots, hauled it in buckets, shoveled it in darkness, when sanitation was not a given, but a duty, a burden shouldered not by systems, but by people. And yet one can't help but wonder, if the pot had never been replaced, if no one had ever dared to ask whether there might be a better way, how long would we have continued to lift the lid, look away and carry on? The table was rough, made of thick wood, not sanded or polished, but serviceable. The edges were worn smooth by elbows, meals and time. There was no tablecloth, no polished silver, no courses served one after the other. Just a single large loaf of coarse bread at the centre, a pitcher of beer not far from it, and a handful of common bowls shared between many. It was supper, or something like it, in a world where food was never quite enough and safety was never quite certain. For most people in medieval Europe, the question of what to eat was not one of choice, but of survival. The overwhelming majority of the population were peasants, labourers bound to land, weather, and the will of lords. Their diets were narrow, repetitive, and dangerously unstable. They relied on whatever could be grown nearby, stored cheaply, and stretched through the lean seasons. Which meant that most of the time they ate bread. Not fluffy loaves, not crusty boules, but heavy, dark, fibrous slabs of barley or rye, mixed with bits of chaff, sometimes sand, often small stones from millstones too worn to work cleanly. It filled the belly, but slowly ruined the teeth. It quieted hunger, but didn't nourish. And always there was beer, not the golden, bubbling kind poured from glass bottles centuries later, but a murky, flat liquid, often thick, sometimes sour. It was brewed at home or in small communal vats, using whatever grain was left over after baking. Hops were used in some places, but more often the brew was flavoured with herbs, roots, or even tree bark. It was mildly alcoholic, enough to dull the senses, but not strong enough to be considered a luxury. Children drank it, the elderly drank it. Water, when it was available, was feared. Too many times it brought illness. The beer, boiled during brewing, was safer, even if it tasted like the inside of a damp barrel. Vegetables appeared in the diet when the season allowed it. Onions, leeks and cabbages were common. Turnips too. Anything that could survive the soil and the short growing season. Meat was rare, sometimes eaten on feast days or stolen from traps in the woods. Most often, though, flavour came from salt and smoke. Fish, if you lived near water, might be dried or salted into submission. Cheese, if the cows had enough to eat, added protein to the table, but often smelled stronger than it tasted. Spoilage was a constant risk. There were no refrigerators, no chemical preservatives, and often no understanding of what caused rot. Bread grew mould, Cheese became slick, ale went sour. People did what they could, scraping, boiling, fermenting, but the results were imperfect. Hunger overrode caution. A spoiled crust was still better than no crust, and sometimes that crust carried something invisible, something lethal. Botulism was rare, but it wasn't the only danger. Foodborne illness took many forms. Ergo, a fungus that grew on rye, was more common and far more insidious. It caused burning sensations in the limbs, hallucinations, convulsions. Entire villages suffered outbreaks, dancing in the streets, clawing at their skin, speaking in tongues. They didn't know it came from their bread. They blamed spirits, saints, witches. The burning illness was called St. Anthony's fire. Prayers were offered. Pilgrimages were made. No one stopped eating the bread. The famine years made things worse. When the crops failed, as they often did in cold, wet seasons, there was no surplus. Grain stores emptied. Peasants turned to tree bark ground into powder. They boiled grasses, chewed on leather. Soup became water with flavourless roots. A single egg was a treasure. Children were given the last scraps. Adults went to sleep with empty stomachs and woke dizzy. Disease came quickly when hunger lived in the house. In better times, though, the food was predictable. Gruel in the morning, bread and beer by noon, a pottage at night, a stew of beans, herbs, and whatever else could be thrown in. The pottage simmered all day, left on the hearth, added to but never quite emptied. It was thick, brown and filling, but if a fly fell in, no one noticed. If the pot went untouched too long and turned sour, it was just stirred harder. It was food. It was life. Salt preserved meat, when meat could be had, but salt itself was expensive. In some towns it was taxed. Smuggling it was a crime. The poor used ashes, vinegar, or fermentation instead. Pickling was a survival tactic, not a taste preference. Vegetables were packed in brine and stored in cool corners, sealed with cloth and hope. If the seal broke, if mould crept in, the pickles might rot or ferment too far. The line between sour and spoiled was thin, and not everyone knew where it lay. Feasting was another world entirely. When lords held banquets, the tables groaned under roasted meats, candied fruits, and spiced wines. These events were spectacles, and sometimes the peasants caught glimpses of them. A leftover joint of mutton tossed to the kitchen boys, a heel of bread discarded to the dogs. But these were exceptions. For most, the richness of the Lord's table was as distant as the stars. The idea of dining for pleasure, of eating more than one kind of meat in a week, was unimaginable. Markets brought some variety, but only for those with coin. Spices, nuts, dried fruits, they came from far away and cost dearly. A pinch of pepper could buy a loaf of bread. Sugar was unknown to most. Honey, when it could be found, was used sparingly. Apples and berries came only in season. They were gathered quickly, eaten fresh, or dried if possible. But preserving fruit was laborious, and often not worth the effort when winter loomed. Still, people found comfort where they could. Meals were eaten slowly, communally, with the same spoons and bowls passed from hand to hand. Bread was torn, not sliced. Beer was ladled from the same bucket. Children leaned against their mothers, half asleep by the fire, clutching crusts. It wasn't about enjoyment. It was about sharing what little there was and surviving until the next meal. But always beneath the surface lurked danger. The invisible world of bacteria, of toxins, of contaminated water and spoiled grain had not yet been named, but it worked silently. The coughs, the fevers, the swollen bellies, they weren't traced to a mould or a fly or a bucket of water drawn too close to the dung heap. They were part of life, part of death. And yet, in the quiet dark of the evening, when the last bit of bread had been soaked in ale and the pot of pottage stirred one last time, did they ever wonder, was this food slowly killing them? Did they taste the danger? Or had their tongues grown so used to it that they simply called it flavour? The field was quiet, except for the wind rustling through the wheat and the heavy thud of a hoe breaking earth. A child stood nearby, clutching a wicker basket with more splinters than strength, squinting against the sunlight. In the distance, a woman knelt in the dirt, collecting leeks, her hands black with soil, her knees numb. It was summer, and that meant food, but no one rejoiced. The summer harvest was not a celebration. It was a race against hunger. Grain ruled everything. Its absence meant death. Its abundance meant survival. The bread it produced was not just a staple, but the anchor of every meal, every table, every life. In France, England, Germany, Poland, the shape of the loaf might vary, but its importance never did. Fields of barley, rye, and sometimes wheat, when the land was kind and the Lord allowed it, were not just landscapes. They were lifelines. But the harvest was not generous. Yields were modest. A bushel planted might return 4 or 5 if the season was kind. More often 3, sometimes only 2. In bad years, even 1. A single storm at the wrong time could flatten entire fields. A cold snap in late spring could stunt the seed before it even began. Flooding, drought, pests, all familiar threats. There were no pesticides, no irrigation systems, only superstition and prayer. Once harvested, the grain had to be dried, threshed, winnowed, milled. Every step presented a new opportunity for contamination. Mice in the sacks, spores in the barn, stones and grit from grinding stones falling into the flour. Most people didn't notice. They were grateful for the heaviness in their stomach, even if their teeth cracked on pebbles. The coarseness of bread was taken for granted. Soft white loaves were reserved for the church and the rich. A peasant's loaf was brown, heavy and dark with bits of straw and husk. It fed, but it also wore the body down, and what it sometimes carried was far worse than dust. Ergot fungus, which infected rye during wet seasons, was invisible to the naked eye. The bread looked the same, it smelled the same, but once eaten, it brought madness. The first sign was often a tingling in the fingers or toes. Then came the burning, as if one's limbs were on fire. Then hallucinations, visions of saints, demons, angels, and snakes. Some danced uncontrollably. Others convulsed. Pregnant women miscarried. Men clawed at their own skin. Villagers would speak of curses, divine punishment, witchcraft. They didn't know it came from the bread. And even if they had known, they had nothing else to eat. These outbreaks were not isolated. Records describe whole communities afflicted, especially in rainy years. Monasteries turned into infirmaries. Priests led mass exorcisms. No one connected the symptoms to the damp stores of rye stacked in the back of granaries. The connection would not be made until centuries later. In the meantime, the bread remained on the table. The beer did not always offer safety either. Brewed in small batches, often in iron pots, it fermented quickly. If left too long or poorly sealed, it could sour or grow thick with residue. Mould might form. The scum was scraped off. Drunk. Because what else was there? The ale at least dulled the hunger, blurred the headaches, softened the edge of daily labour. It didn't need to be perfect, it just needed to be wet. People believed they were safer drinking ale than water, and they were often right. Wells were shallow, shared, and sometimes dug too close to latrines or animal pens. Surface water, rivers, streams, ponds, was used for everything. Washing clothes, watering livestock, discarding refuse, even cleaning wounds. It carried the memory of 1,000 acts, and when drunk, it returned them to the body. Dysentery, fever, cramping. A child could be fine in the morning and cold by nightfall. But when ale ran out or grain was low, water was the fallback. There was no other choice. Preservation was an art of desperation. Salting meat was one method, but salt was valuable. Too much could make meat inedible. Too little left it soft and dangerous. Smoking was better, if you had the wood, the time and the skill. Fermentation offered solutions for vegetables, dairy, even fish, but it took knowledge passed down through generations. Missteps could result in spoilage, or worse. Botulism was not understood, but its results were noted. Blurred vision, difficulty breathing, paralysis, death. Entire families could vanish within days. The cause would be guessed at, mourned, and forgotten. Even dairy, a source of nutrition when animals were kind enough to produce, could betray. Milk soured quickly. Without pasteurization, it carried pathogens with ease. Cheese helped, but soft cheeses went bad fast. Hard cheeses required care, and mould was always watching. Some moulds were harmless, some were not. No one could tell. In good years, a garden might provide fresh beans, peas, garlic, onions, parsnips. Herbs like thyme, sage, or parsley added flavour. But the growing season was short, and gardens were vulnerable to animals, weather, children's clumsy feet. What grew well was eaten quickly or preserved with vinegar, buried in crocks, stored in root cellars. Even then, spoilage was inevitable. Rats invaded, mice nibbled, jars cracked in the cold. The food you thought you had in November might be gone by February. Winter was the season of reckoning. The meat smoked in autumn was now hard and dry, the bread was black and crumbly. The ale might have gone sour, and the cabbage, pickled though it was, smelled stronger than anyone liked. The hunger returned, subtly at first, then fiercely. Families rationed, mothers ate less. The old sometimes starved themselves to feed the young. When spring came, the relief was not joy but endurance, survival once again. Despite all this, food remained at the heart of culture. Songs were sung about bread. Recipes passed down, even if they only changed by a pinch. Feasts were remembered years after they ended. Children learned early which berries to pick, which mushrooms to fear, how to boil bones for broth. The knowledge lived in fingers, in smells, in taste, but it never erased the risk. And so each meal brought quiet tension. Was this bread safe? Was the beer still good? Had the cabbage gone too soft? Did the meat smell strange? Could the child eat this without falling ill? The answers were rarely clear. They ate anyway. Hunger didn't wait for certainty. And still one wonders, in that final moment before lifting the spoon or tearing the bread, did they hesitate? Did they pause just briefly and ask themselves, not aloud, not for fear of worry, could this bite be the one that changes everything? The fire crackled low in the hearth, more for light than warmth, and the smell of the evening meal hung heavy in the room. A thick stew bubbled in a blackened pot, balanced over the embers with a piece of iron bent into a hook. Bread, dark and tough from days of storage, sat on a wooden board nearby. There was beer too, home-brewed, cloudy, slightly sour. A family gathered around it, their movements slow, their eyes soft with fatigue. They didn't speak much. There was no need. The food would speak for them. To eat in a time like this was not an act of pleasure. It was an act of survival. Each bite was the result of labour. From tilling the soil, to sowing seed, to harvesting grain, to drying, grinding, baking. A meal was the sum of dozens of hands, all of them weathered, and none of them well fed. Nothing was wasted. Crusts were soaked in broth. Bones were cracked to suck the marrow. Cabbage leaves were layered into every pot, and stale cheese was stirred into gruel. Even the scraps fed chickens or pigs, if there were any. The season shaped everything. Spring meant bitter greens and the hope of eggs. Summer brought root vegetables and some milk. Autumn gave apples and beans. Winter meant preservation, rationing and prayer. The medieval diet was not just dangerous because of spoilage, it was dangerous because it rarely changed. There were no vitamins as we know them now, no charts, no labels. Nutritional deficiency was a ghost with many names: lethargy, rickets, bad humours, wasting. It lived in children's hollow eyes and the swollen limbs of the elderly. It sat at every table and drank first. Yet rituals developed to give food meaning. Grace was said before meals, not just as a gesture of thanks, but as protection. Some believed prayers might purify the food, ward off spoilage. The saints were invoked not only in famine but in illness. St. Nicholas for bread, St. Brigid for dairy, St. Sebastian for plague. People didn't understand bacteria, but they understood fear, and they gave that fear a shape, a saint, a sin, a sickness that could be bargained with. Meals were public and private at once. In large households, Food was distributed according to rank: lord, servant, animal. In peasant homes, everyone ate the same, though not always equally. The man who worked the fields might eat first, the youngest was often fed last. Widows and orphans depended on charity or the scraps of neighbours. Hospitality, even when there was little to give, became a form of social currency. A bowl shared with a traveller, a hunk of bread for the midwife, a ladle of stew for the priest. Each gift remembered, each gesture returned in time. Famine brought new lessons. In the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, it rained for months. Crops drowned in the fields, grain moulded in storage, the roads turned to sludge. Families resorted to boiling bark, eating grass, chewing on the leather straps of worn-out shoes. Stories spread of worse, of cannibalism, of madness. Whether all were true didn't matter. The fear stuck, even in better years. That fear lingered beneath the tongue. Eat while there is food. Store it. Stretch it. Hide a bit of grain in the chimney or beneath the floorboards just in case. Knowledge of food passed slowly from one cook's hand to another. Recipes were not written, but remembered. Add until it feels right. Boil until it smells like home. The cook, usually the woman of the house, learned by watching. When to salt, when to stir, when to throw something out. These decisions were not always right, but they were made with love. And in a world without safety nets, love was a kind of seasoning too. There were sometimes festivals. Feast days tied to the church calendar marked rare moments of indulgence. Richer dishes, sweetened breads, spiced stews. Even the poor found ways to celebrate. Pancakes on Shrove Tuesday. Lamb on Easter if the flock survived. Pies filled with wild berries. A single roast chicken for a wedding. These meals were remembered long after the taste had faded. A child who tasted honey for the first time might carry the memory for life. But for most days, food was fuel. Rough, simple, sometimes spoiled, often dangerous. And yet, life continued. Children grew, families gathered. Old men sat by the fire and spoke of meals past, not as gluttons, but as survivors. Food was not just nourishment. It was continuity. The same bread, the same stew year after year, the same smell of beer bubbling in a cracked jug, the same creak of the spoon in the pot. These were sounds of life holding on. As towns grew and trade expanded, variety came slowly. Spices arrived, sugar began to appear in markets, potatoes and maize came from across the sea, though not yet on most tables. For centuries, though, the core of the diet remained unchanged. Bread and beer, roots and salt, stew again and again and again. Eventually, with the rise of science and the slow adoption of hygiene, people began to understand what had been killing them. Mold, bacteria, toxins. The invisible became visible, but by then countless lives had already passed through the narrow doorway of mealtime caution. No expiration dates warned them. No label said refrigerate after opening. There was only the tongue, the nose, the stomach, and time. Today the variety is dizzying. The danger, mostly hidden. Food is entertainment, identity, luxury. But for centuries it was a question. Not what do I want to eat, but will this hurt me? A loaf could be salvation or poison. A stew could warm the soul or steal the breath. A beer could quench or sicken. It was a gamble every day, and most didn't even know they were gambling. Still, one can't help but wonder, did they dream of better meals? Of soft bread, clean water, sweet fruit? Or had they forgotten the taste of safety entirely, and learned to call their dangers by gentler names? The sun hung low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the yard, but no water was drawn. The basin stood empty. The towel, if one could call it that, was stiff with dust. A young girl sat in the doorway of a narrow wooden cottage, brushing her fingers through her hair, not to clean it, but to ease the tangles. No soap, no suds, no splashing, only silence. She had never had a bath. In the medieval world, and for many centuries beyond it, bathing was not what we imagine today. There were no morning showers, No evening soaks, no scented soaps lined along porcelain tubs. Water, though ever present in rivers, wells and rain, was not always trusted. It was too often cold, too often scarce, too often blamed for sickness. And so, for countless people across generations, cleanliness came not from washing, but from avoiding dirt in the first place. For most, bathing with water was rare, not just because of the effort it required, but because many believed it opened the body to harm. Warm water in particular was thought to soften the flesh, open the pores, and allow in bad humours, miasmas, or even spirits. A bath, improperly timed, could bring on fevers. For the elderly, it was said to invite death. For women, it was believed to weaken fertility. And for the sick, it was dangerous by default. Instead, people turned to alternatives. They changed their linens, if they had them. They wiped their bodies with dry cloths. They dusted themselves with powders, ashes, crushed herbs, even dried flower petals. These dry baths, as they would later be called, were acts of maintenance more than purification. A cloth under the arms, a bit of wool behind the knees, a handful of lavender rubbed into the scalp. It was about managing odour, not removing it entirely. The very idea of cleanliness was different. Today we associate it with freshness, the absence of sweat, the smooth surface of just washed skin. Then it was measured differently. Clean meant not visibly filthy. Clean meant no dung clinging to your hem. Clean meant not reeking so strongly that your neighbours flinched. A strong perfume could pass for hygiene. A fresh shirt was as good as a bath. A cap covered unwashed hair. Gloves concealed hands that had never touched soap. Public bathhouses did exist in earlier centuries, especially in the Roman world and its eastern successors. In medieval Islamic cities and parts of southern Europe, communal bathing persisted for longer. But elsewhere in Europe, the bathhouse became increasingly suspect. In some towns, they were seen as places of sin, too often associated with brothels or unclean acts. Some were shut down entirely. Others remained open but changed in function. Less washing, more sweating, more gossiping, more ritual than reality. Even when people bathed, it was different. A peasant might pour a bucket over himself in the river once a year, or soak briefly in the wooden tub if one could be borrowed. Soap, if used at all, was made from animal fat and lye, coarse and stinging. Most preferred to skip it. They might scrub with sand or oat husks, scrape with a knife, or rub their skin with oil and wipe it away with a cloth. These methods didn't clean deeply, but they removed the top layer of grime, enough to be called good enough. Clothes mattered more than bodies. A shirt could be boiled, a smock could be rinsed in a stream and dried in the sun. Outer garments were seldom washed, but undergarments carried the burden of sweat. Women's shifts, men's linens, children's simple tunics. These were laundered when possible. A person wearing clean underclothes was considered clean, no matter what lay beneath. It was a visual standard, not a hygienic one. And there were perfumes, not the refined distillations of later centuries, but sharp, pungent concoctions made from herbs, flowers, roots. Sage, rosemary, lavender, wormwood, and rosewater were all used, soaked into cloths, hung in rooms, worn in little pouches tied around the waist. Some people placed small cones of fragrant wax on their heads, designed to melt slowly and release scent throughout the day. Others rubbed their hands with vinegar mixed with petals, a crude form of cologne. Scent masked reality. It didn't change it. Barbers helped too. Their work wasn't limited to haircuts. They lanced boils, pulled teeth, and occasionally shaved away lice-infested patches of scalp. In towns, barbers offered washing services, quick scrubs, rinses, and the use of combs, but water was still used cautiously, heated in small amounts, applied by hand, not poured freely. It was not a bath, but a gesture. Monasteries maintained stricter standards. Some religious orders mandated regular washing, particularly of feet and hands. Ritual purity mattered. Bathing became a spiritual act, tied to humility. But even in these places, full immersion was rare. Basins were shared, towels reused, soap was a luxury, In cold weather, water froze. In warm weather, it evaporated. Cleanliness was seasonal. Illness often changed the rules. If someone fell sick, their bedding might be washed, their body wiped with vinegar or strong-smelling herbs. The sick were more likely to be washed, though often too late. Doctors recommended sponging with rosewater or wine. Some insisted on bathing only after bleeding or purging. A few advised the opposite. The advice was inconsistent and mostly ineffective. And yet, despite all of this, people lived. They married, they bore children, they gathered at markets, celebrated festivals, knelt in church. The smell of bodies was not offensive, it was normal, part of the air. If someone reeked, it was usually from illness, not sweat. The body had a scent, and everyone shared it. The idea of scrubbing it away was not just impractical, it was alien. Still one wonders, did anyone long for the feeling of truly clean skin? Did they dream, without knowing the words, of hot water cascading from above, of soap foaming against flesh, of stepping out of a bath not just unsoiled but transformed? Or did they simply close their eyes, dust their sleeves with sage, and believe that this too was enough? The morning began with cloth, not water, not soap. A strip of woven linen folded over twice was drawn slowly down the arms, around the neck, under the chin. It wasn't wet, it wasn't scented, it was simply a tool, soft from use, stained from repetition, familiar in its purpose. The woman using it did not expect it to cleanse her, she only hoped it would ease the itching. In medieval and early modern Europe, the relationship between people and their own bodies was different from what we now imagine. Cleanliness was not pursued as an absolute goal, but as a balancing act. You were not meant to be completely clean. You were meant to avoid being visibly or offensively dirty. That distinction shaped everything. It shaped how you were judged, how you presented yourself, how you moved through the world. The average person could go weeks, sometimes months, without a full body wash, and yet they were not seen as unclean, because no one else was bathing regularly either. Entire towns smelled of animals, sweat, food and ash. To isolate your own scent from the city around you was impossible. If anything, washing too often could provoke suspicion. It was considered vain, indulgent, even unhealthy. The notion of scrubbing the body thoroughly, removing all oils, all residue, all signs of labour, that belonged more to monks in moments of ritual than to the working poor. There were exceptions, of course. In warmer parts of the world, particularly in the Islamic regions of North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Spain and Sicily, public baths were common and valued. Hygiene was linked to faith. Washing before prayer was a sacred duty. These cultures developed elaborate bathhouse rituals, complete with heated chambers, marble benches, and scented oils. In these places, a bath was not dangerous, it was life-affirming. But elsewhere in Europe, that tradition weakened. The loss of Roman infrastructure, the rise of fears about waterborne disease, and shifting religious attitudes all combined to reduce the frequency of bathing. After outbreaks of plague, some doctors warned against washing entirely, arguing that water might open the body to infection. Others advised that only the hands and face should be touched, and only with special solutions, vinegar, rosewater or alcohol. The rest of the body could remain untouched. Better to be dusty than dead. And so alternatives multiplied. People used dry herbs to rub the skin, rosemary, sage, mint. Some made powders from chalk or clay to dab on oily areas. Feet were dusted with flour, armpits with crushed lavender. In households that could afford it, servants aired clothing daily, shaking out fleas, brushing dirt away. Garments were smoked over herbs or packed with lavender in chests. It was all an effort to prevent stench, not by washing it away, but by preventing its arrival. Hair was combed, not washed. Lice were common, but managed. Metal combs with fine teeth scraped away nits. In noble households, ladies in waiting spent hours each week carefully inspecting their mistress's hair. Oils were sometimes applied, not to clean, but to tame and perfume. Washing the scalp with water was rare, feared to cause headaches, or worse, madness. People wore hoods, veils, caps. not for modesty alone, but to keep dust out and heat in. A covered head was a cleaner head. Hands were cleaned more often than any other part of the body. This was partly due to necessity. Hands were visible, used constantly, and expected to be presentable, especially at meals. Before eating, water was poured from jugs over cupped palms. Towels were shared. The idea of soap existed, but true soap, hard lye-based, scented, was expensive. Most used ash or sand. The sensation was abrasive, but it removed grease. Feet too were sometimes washed, especially in religious contexts. The ritual of foot washing, drawn from biblical tradition, was practiced on holy days. It was symbolic but also practical. The feet carried dust, sweat and soil. In some monasteries, younger monks were tasked with washing the feet of the elder ones. In some noble households, lords washed the feet of their servants once a year, as an act of humility. These were rare moments of contact, both physical and spiritual, but full immersion in water remained rare. When it happened, it was a major event. A wedding might call for a bath, so might a birth or a death. The tub, often shared by the entire household, was filled with buckets drawn from a well or stream, heated slowly, poured carefully. The bather sat crouched, knees to chest, in a cramped barrel or wooden basin. The water cooled quickly. The soap, if there was any, left a film. When done, the water was not discarded. Others used it, often in order of rank or age. By the end, it was murky and cold, but still better than nothing. The body was dried with coarse cloth, sometimes nothing more than sack linen. The hair, left wet, was wrapped in fabric and left to air. There were no hairdryers, no towels as we know them. A person emerged from a bath not refreshed, but often shivering. The risk of illness was real. Some swore never to bathe again. Others waited another year. Even among the wealthy, bathing was infrequent. Queen Elizabeth I of England is said to have bathed once a month whether she needed it or not. The phrasing, likely apocryphal, still speaks to the general attitude. Bathing was an event, not a habit. Something to be arranged, scheduled, survived. Despite this, people developed systems: dry scrubbing, spot cleaning, perfumed gloves, vinegar rinses, clean clothes over dirty skin, the daily routines of dressing, undressing, brushing, dusting, oiling. These were not neglectful. They were adaptations. In a world where water was risky and soap expensive, people found other ways. And yet, one has to wonder, when they stood near a river on a warm day and the light danced across the current, did they feel a pull? Did they long, just briefly, to step in, to immerse themselves, to let the water do what cloth and herb could not? Did they wonder what it would feel like to be truly clean, not just presentable, not just masked, but refreshed inside and out? The room was dim, the window small and high on the wall, casting just enough light to make out the dust suspended in the air. A woman stood with her back to the hearth, gently beating a shirt against the doorframe to shake out the ash and hair that clung to it. She paused, holding it to her face, then folded it with care. That shirt, though unwashed in weeks, was clean enough. It did not stink. It did not shame her. In her world, that was what counted. For generation after generation, people lived without touching soap to skin, without running water over their backs, without ever stepping into what we would call a bath. Their standards were different. Their expectations shaped by scarcity, fear and necessity. And what might seem unbearable now, the layered grime, the perfumed cover-ups, the avoidance of water, was, for them, not filth. It was simply how life worked. They didn't question it often, because few had ever known anything different. Bathing as a regular ritual had vanished with empires long buried. The ruins of Roman bathhouses still stood in some towns, hollow and cold, filled with pigeons. Children played near the broken mosaics without knowing what they once meant. To them, water was for drinking, for cooking, for cooling animals. It was not something to waste on the skin unless you had no choice. And when people did bathe, there were costs. Drawing water from a well meant lifting heavy buckets. Heating it meant firewood, time, labour. Then there was privacy, rare in homes where families lived together, in 1 or 2 rooms, and when the bath was done, the water had to be discarded, often into the same yard where animals lived and food was grown. If the water had been soiled by illness or blood, it carried special risks. Some whispered it brought misfortune if spilled too near the house, others swore it fed evil spirits. Few were eager to test the truth. In wealthier households, especially those with servants and more rooms, the story was different but not always better. Tubs were larger, water more plentiful, but the attitudes remained cautious. Bathing too often was still discouraged. Doctors warned of fevers, faintness, even death. Too much water was said to weaken the constitution. The body, they believed, built up a protective layer of oil, of dirt, of sweat that sealed in health. Stripping it away with hot water was like tearing bark from a tree. Yet, there were always those who longed for something different. Travellers who had once visited bathhouses in far-off cities and spoken of tiled steam rooms and scented pools. Healers who believed that warm water could soothe aching joints. Women who remembered the feel of rain on skin in springtime and wondered if that too counted as cleansing. The Enlightenment began to bring change, but slowly. With it came curiosity, measurement, and a cautious return to physical observation. Scientists studied the body more closely. Doctors began to understand how disease could spread, not through sin or scent, but through invisible agents that clung to hands, linens, wounds. Cleanliness began to shift from a matter of social presentation to a matter of health. The change was not sudden, but gradual, like a tide rising so slowly you don't feel it at first. By the 18th and 19th centuries, more people were beginning to wash regularly. Soap became cheaper, cloth became easier to launder. Public baths were rebuilt in some cities, not as dens of vice, but as modern facilities. The connection between hygiene and health was finally gaining authority. Still, resistance remained. Some clung to old beliefs, some lacked the means, but others adapted, and the standards of cleanliness began to rise. The Industrial Revolution, with its urban sprawl and crowded tenements, made washing both more urgent and more complicated. The dirt of factories, of coal smoke, of sewer-clogged streets demanded some kind of remedy. Slowly, water pipes were laid. Indoor plumbing became less rare. The first bathrooms were built not for comfort, but for function. Cold, small rooms with tubs that echoed when filled. A new habit was born, yet even then it took time for the old world to vanish. In rural homes, the dry bath survived well into the 20th century. In some places, it survives still. There are still people who remember their grandmothers warming water on the stove and pouring it into a basin. Still people who recall how Saturday night meant a shared bath, and Sunday meant your cleanest clothes. Still those who remember that strange silence that comes after washing, a kind of peace or perhaps relief, unfamiliar but welcome. Today we are drenched in water daily. We scrub, rinse, condition, exfoliate. We speak of cleanliness as if it were morality, as if to be dirty is to be wrong. But not so long ago, dirt was just the shape of life. To be clean was not to be washed, but to be decent, covered, composed, perhaps even scented if one could afford it. And yet the old ways left a trace, a carefulness about the body, a knowledge of how to stay fresh without a faucet, a rhythm of maintenance, dusting, brushing, wrapping, that spoke of intimacy with one's own skin. They had no soap as we do, no showers, no tubs that filled with the twist of a knob, but they had methods and meaning. And still one wonders, in that final moment before plunging into a rare bath, when the water was hot and ready and time had been carved from the day, did they pause? Did they step in slowly, feeling the warmth rise up their legs, and think, not of sin or sickness, but of something deeper, of renewal, of what it might feel like to leave the dirt behind? As always, this is a complete, uninterrupted historical narrative, written in a calm and immersive tone, with every word thoughtfully included. This story focuses on a particularly neglected but essential part of daily life, the medieval mouth, and everything that went into maintaining or failing to maintain it. Story 5, Toothworms and Rotten Breath, Dental Care in the Dark Ages. Section 1, The Ache That Wouldn't End. The man sat on a low stool near the hearth, cradling the side of his face in a calloused hand. His eyes were half closed, not from sleep but from pain. The right side of his jaw had swollen overnight, the skin stretched taut, red and hot to the touch. A single tooth, blackened, cracked and humming with ache, held his entire attention. He could think of nothing else, and yet there was nothing to be done. In the world before dentistry, pain in the mouth was not a symptom, it was a condition. Something lived with, managed, endured. The idea of brushing teeth, of flossing, of seeing a doctor trained to treat oral disease was as foreign to a medieval peasant as the notion of flying across the ocean. You might go to a barber, or a monk, or a blacksmith if the pain became unbearable. But mostly you suffered, quietly. People did clean their teeth, in their own ways. Chewing sticks made from fibrous twigs like willow or hazel were rubbed along the gums to scrape away food. Ashes were sometimes used as a scrub mixed with water or vinegar. Powdered herbs like mint, sage or thyme were rubbed onto teeth with a cloth. Some boiled wine and swished it around the mouth. But these rituals were less about preventing decay and more about freshening breath. And even that was limited by time, resources and understanding. The concept of dental hygiene as we know it simply didn't exist. There was no knowledge of plaque, of enamel, of bacteria. Teeth hurt when they wanted to. They broke. They fell out. And often they poisoned the body from within. Infections that began in the mouth could spread through the bloodstream. A rotten molar might lead to fever, then delirium, then death. But no one connected the dots. No one traced the illness back to the mouth. Instead, they blamed worms. Toothworms were a widely held belief across cultures. Pain in the tooth, they reasoned, must be caused by a creature boring into the bone. The idea was ancient, rooted in Babylonian, Egyptian, and later Greek medicine. It persisted through the medieval period and into the early modern age. Treatments were designed to kill or drive out the worm, smoking the mouth with burnt henbane, rinsing with garlic and vinegar, inserting hot needles into the gum. None worked. But they tried, because what else could they do? Breath was another matter. Halitosis, though not named, was acknowledged. It was not just unpleasant, it was spiritual. A foul breath was believed by some to indicate a corrupted soul. Monks fasted to cleanse their bodies and prayed for purer air. Others chewed cloves or fennel seeds before kissing. Priests burned incense near the mouth of the dying. And yet, for most, breath was just another burden. Everyone smelled. Everyone endured. Children's teeth were often strong in youth, then rotted quickly in adolescence. Sugar was rare, but not unknown. Fruits, dried and fresh, contributed natural sugars. Bread, beer and porridge left residue. Cleaning was inconsistent. By 30, many had already lost several teeth. By 40, toothless mouths were common. People gummed their food or soaked it in ale. Hard crusts were broken and softened. Meat, if chewed at all, was sliced thin or pounded soft. Toothache was one of the great shared torments, chronic, invisible and inescapable. A person with an aching molar could go mad from the pressure, the slow throb, the heat. Remedies were passed down through households. Apply a poultice of warm onions, bite on a clove, hold salt beneath the tongue, spit into the fire and curse the pain. And when none of these worked, the last resort remained: extraction. The pulling of a tooth was not a procedure. It was an act, sudden, brutal, performed with tongs or pliers or bare hands. The person doing the pulling might be a barber surgeon, a market tooth drawer, or a neighbour with enough strength and no fear of blood. There were no anaesthetics. You were held down, the instrument inserted. A twist, a crack, a scream. The tooth came out if you were lucky. If not, part of it remained, the pain followed, and the bleeding didn't stop. Tooth drawers became known figures in towns. Some wore costumes, some carried their extracted teeth in jars, proof of their skill. In marketplaces, they might offer public demonstrations, pulling a tooth in front of a crowd, earning coin and ore in equal measure. but the risk was great. A poorly pulled tooth could lead to infection, locked jaw, even death. Still, people lined up. Anything was better than the pain. Among the wealthy, things were not always better. They might have finer food, but also more sugar. Candied fruits, wine, sweetmeats. By the late Middle Ages, the elite began to suffer dental problems in new ways. The same sweets that marked their status rotted their teeth. Paintings from the period sometimes show nobles with closed mouths, lips drawn tight, not in modesty, but in concealment. Still, their solutions mirrored those of the poor. Tooth powders made from crushed coral, burnt shells, or ground pearls. Scented cloths, expensive spices, but no true protection. When pain came, it was as cruel in the palace as in the hovel, and so people lived with it. The ache, the rot, the looseness of a tooth that would not fall out, the sweetness of a fruit followed by the stabbing of nerves exposed. The smell of a mouth not cleaned in weeks. It was not shameful, it was normal. Just another part of being human in a time when comfort was rare and pain was patient. Still, one wonders, in the quiet hours before dawn when the world was still and the mouth pulsed with fire, did they ever dream, not of beauty, not of white smiles, but simply of relief, of waking without pain, of a world where a tooth could be saved? The man who pulled teeth did not live in a house. He lived in a tent or sometimes beneath a wooden cart. He travelled from town to town, arriving with the sound of bells or dogs barking or the whispers of children running ahead to see what he would do next. He was not a doctor, he was not trusted, but when the pain grew too much to bear, people found him. He wore a thick apron stained with old blood and carried a sack of tools, long, cruel metal tongs, hooks and curved knives. Some were real instruments, others were shaped from farm tools or iron scraps. His hands were rough and he rarely smiled, but he could grip a tooth and tear it free in seconds. And when someone sat before him, mouth open, breath sharp with rot, he didn't ask questions. He simply worked. In the absence of true dentistry, these men became both feared and necessary. Their skill varied wildly. Some were fast, some were strong, some knew the trick of rocking the tooth instead of yanking it. Others tore flesh, broke jaws, and left mouths worse than they had found them. There were no guarantees. A man might arrive with pain and leave with silence, or with more blood than he could spare. But extraction was only one part of the story. For most people, the pain came long before the pulling, and so they sought relief in other ways. Herbs were a common remedy. Cloves, chewed or packed into the mouth, offered mild numbing. They were traded at high value and often reserved for the worst cases. Sage was boiled into teas or mashed into poultices. Mint, rosemary and thyme were used to soothe, to scent, to distract. But these were not cures. At best, they calmed the nerves. At worst, they disguised infection. People made charms. Tiny bones carved with symbols worn on strings around the neck. A tooth tied with red thread. Words written in Latin or local dialects, spoken over aching gums, as though language itself might push the pain away. In some villages, mothers whispered blessings into their children's mouths before bed. In others, teeth were buried beneath the hearthstone when they fell out, hidden from evil spirits who might steal them. Superstition filled the gap left by medicine. In some regions, it was believed that sleeping with a piece of silver beneath the tongue could ease dental pain. In others, rubbing the tooth with bread baked on Easter morning was said to cleanse it. The logic was not scientific, but it was human, hope wrapped in ritual. When infection set in, there was little to be done. The face swelled, the jaw stiffened, the gums bled and oozed. Fever followed, and then silence. Some survived, some did not. A man might lose half his teeth and live to see his grandchildren. Another might die from a single molar gone bad. The difference was chance. No one knew why. Mouthwash, in its earliest forms, did exist. Wine was swished and spat. Vinegar, strong and acidic, was used to rinse. Some chewed charcoal to clean the mouth, though the gritty texture wore down enamel over time. A mixture of honey and salt was applied to sores, though it burned. Water, when used, was often warm and mixed with herbs. but these rinses were as much ritual as remedy. The better off had access to more exotic options: imported spices, scented oils, even early versions of tooth powders, ground coral, chalk, cinnamon. In elite households, servants prepared bowls of warm water for hand washing and mouth rinsing after meals. Silver toothpicks, finely made, were used to pick debris from between teeth. They were often worn as status symbols, hanging from belts or necklaces. Cleanliness was fashionable, but not necessarily effective. There were no fillings, no crowns. A broken tooth stayed broken. A cracked molar was a ticking clock. Some tried to pack gaps with cloth or wax. Others filled cavities with pepper or crushed herbs, hoping to draw out the evil. The pain usually returned. There was no stopping it. Children were not spared. Teething was a dangerous time. Without modern medicine, infants suffering from swollen gums and fever were often thought to be cursed. Some parents resorted to cutting the gums with knives to let the teeth breathe. Others gave the child a piece of metal or bone to chew, believing it would help. Many babies died during teething, not because of the teeth themselves, but from infection or fever worsened by poor nutrition and unsanitary conditions. Even when the first teeth came in clean, they were rarely protected. Sweets were occasional, but starches were constant. Bread, porridge, ale, fruits all left residue. Teeth rotted, quietly. By adolescence, many children had already begun to complain of pain. By adulthood, they simply learned to live with it. And so, people adapted. They chewed on the opposite side of the mouth. They avoided cold drinks or hot broth. They pressed fingers to their faces when the ache grew sharp. They avoided speech when their breath was sour. They became quiet, inward, cautious. Pain shapes behaviour even when it is invisible. There was in all of this a kind of dignity, not from cleanliness or medical care, but from endurance. People learned to suffer privately, to chew slowly, to smile with closed lips, to share clothes when they could, and keep silent when they couldn't. Their mouths were rarely healthy, but they were rarely idle either. They ate, drank, spoke, kissed, and prayed, despite the pain, because they had no choice. Still, one wonders, when someone finally lost their last tooth, when the ache was gone and the mouth was empty, did they feel relief, or did they miss something? The sound of chewing, the taste of crust, the quiet presence of a tooth that even in its agony reminded them they were alive? The old man sat by the window, the last light of the day stretching across the floorboards. He wore a woolen cap, pulled low over his ears, and his hands trembled slightly as he held a wooden cup. He had no teeth. He hadn't for years. He ate broth, soft bread soaked in ale, bits of fish when he could find them. His mouth moved slowly, lips pursed and careful, tongue shifting the food rather than chewing. No one spoke of it. No one found it strange. It was simply the way of things. To be toothless was a sign of age, of time endured, of survival even. Most people did not reach old age, and those who did rarely kept their teeth. By 40 or 50, the mouth had been through 1,000 quiet battles, against rot, against heat and cold, against absence. There were no dentures, no replacements. A missing tooth was not restored. It left a gap and then another, until the mouth became a silent place, shaped more by what had been lost than by what remained. And yet people continued to eat, to speak, to kiss, to live. They adapted. Food was prepared differently. Bread was dipped in stew. Roots were mashed. Apples were sliced thin. Conversation slowed. Voices softened. Words slurred at the edges, but the meaning remained. The body found its way. Some made crude substitutes. Wood carved into tooth shapes, tied with wire or thread, stuffed into the gums. Animal teeth filed down and pressed into sockets. None lasted long. Most caused more pain than they solved. But they were attempts, acts of resistance against the slow silence of the mouth. In churches and homes, prayers were still said for those in pain. Saints were invoked, Saint Apollonia in particular, who became the patroness of those with aching teeth. Legend said her own teeth were pulled by torturers before her martyrdom, and so she came to be seen as a protector of the suffering. Her image appeared in stained glass and illuminated manuscripts, often holding a tooth in a pair of tongs. People lit candles to her, whispered her name in the dark, not because they expected a miracle, but because it helped to say something. For the poor, pain was endured in silence. But for the rich, decay brought different consequences. Royal mouths, fed on sugared delicacies and strong wine, suffered their own kind of rot. Records describe kings with blackened teeth, queens with ulcers in the gums, nobles who refused to open their mouths in public. Court painters perfected the art of the closed-lip portrait. Poets described kisses as sweet, but often spoke of love in metaphors that did not involve breath. Medical texts of the time began to reflect growing curiosity. Scholars wrote of gum disease, of toothworms writhing beneath the enamel. They recommended fumigations, holding herbs to the mouth and breathing the smoke, or rinses of honey and vinegar. Some suggested poking the gums with needles dipped in wine. There were even recipes for pastes made of burnt eggshells, ashes, and salt. But the knowledge was incomplete, and the results uneven. The body carried the burden. Infected teeth led to abscesses. Abscesses led to swelling, then fever. A person might lose consciousness from the pressure alone. The infection spread, blood carried it. Organs shut down. The cause of death might be recorded as fever or natural causes, but it had begun with a small hole in a tooth, an ache that had seemed survivable. And still people loved each other, whispered secrets, shared food, laughed, complained of their teeth in the same way they complained of the weather or a sore back. Not as tragedies, but as facts, things to endure. They did not dwell on what couldn't be cured. They worked around it, adapted, found gentler food or stronger wine, sat by the fire and told stories with the teeth they had left. It wasn't that they accepted pain exactly. It was that they lived alongside it, as one might live beside a noisy neighbour. Occasionally intrusive, always present, rarely acknowledged. Only when the pain grew sharp, when it flared like fire in the jaw, did they speak. And even then, only briefly. A grunt, a curse, a prayer, then back to silence. In time, the world changed. Dentistry emerged as a science, slowly, hesitantly. Tools became refined, knowledge spread. The idea of cleaning teeth regularly gained ground. Brushes appeared, first as luxury items, then as common ones. The toothbrush became a household tool. Paste replaced powder. Metal replaced wood. Dentists trained. Drills evolved. The pain did not disappear, but for the first time people had hope that it might. Yet even now, echoes remain, the fear of the dentist's chair, the memory of old remedies, cloves, salt, vinegar, the quiet discomfort when a tooth begins to throb. Somewhere deep in the body a knowledge remains. The mouth is powerful and fragile. The smallest ache can bring the strongest to their knees, and the oldest part of the body to fail is often the one that once made us smile. Still, one wonders, did they ever dream of us? Of warm water and minty foam, of sterile rooms and gleaming tools, of pain that could be numbed and decay that could be reversed? Or did they simply press their hand to their jaw, close their eyes and imagine silence? Not the silence of toothlessness, but of peace. The noblewoman sat very still as her maid dabbed her neck with a cloth soaked in violet water. Her gown had been laid out earlier, dusted with crushed lavender and rose petals. A small sachet of herbs was tied to her waist by a silk cord. Above her head, resting neatly in place beneath a towering headdress, was a delicate cone of wax and myrrh, scented with oils and shaped like a drop of honey. It would melt slowly through the day, releasing fragrance and softening the stale air that clung to her every movement, or so she believed. For centuries, scent was not just an accessory, it was a necessity. In a world where bathing was rare, where cities reeked of refuse and chamber pots, and where illness was blamed on foul smells rather than invisible germs, perfume became a kind of armour. To be noble was not to be clean, but to smell expensive. A poor man might scrub with lye and cold water until his skin cracked. but he would still be seen as filthy if he smelled of earth and sweat. A nobleman, unwashed for weeks, could enter a room perfumed in musk, civet or rose and be praised for his refinement. It was not what you did, it was what you carried. Perfume had always been present in human history, but in medieval Europe it took on special meaning. After the fall of Roman bathing culture, and as fears of public nudity and plague increased, washing the body with water fell out of favour. Instead, people turned to dry cleaning methods, changing linens, brushing skin, and above all applying scent. Distilled perfumes were expensive, imported from the Middle East or created in the rarest apothecaries. The ingredients were exotic: ambergris from Wales, musk from deer, attar of roses, aloes wood, frankincense and sandalwood. They came in small bottles, kept close to the body, touched to the skin only in tiny drops. A person might go months without a bath, but perfume was applied daily if they could afford it. The myth of the perfumed cone, often associated with ancient Egypt, persisted in European imagination for centuries. Paintings, illustrations, and even costume designs depicted nobles wearing wax cones atop their heads, sometimes frozen in place by ribbons or pins. These cones, it was said, would melt slowly, bathing the wearer in scent, hiding the smell of sweat and dust. In truth, this was a misunderstanding. The original Egyptian images showed headpieces, likely symbolic or part of ceremonial attire, never confirmed to be real, melting perfume. But the idea stuck, and in courts across Europe, stories spread of foreign lands where scent was worn like a crown. Closer to home, nobles relied on more practical methods. Glove makers became perfumers, scenting their wares with jasmine, violet or neroli. Gloves were a status symbol and a necessity in a world where hands did far more work than most imagined. A perfumed glove was not just pleasant, it was a statement. One could raise a hand to the face, breathe in gently, and ward off the smell of a crowded hall, a filthy street, or the breath of a suitor. Rooms were scented too. Pomanders, small metal balls filled with herbs and resins, were carried on belts or necklaces. They could be opened, refilled, closed again. A nobleman might carry one lined with amber and cloves. A woman might wear one filled with marjoram or dried orange peel. Some pomanders were elaborately crafted, with inner chambers that opened like a puzzle box. They were toys, but they were also medicine. The belief that sweet smells repelled disease was deeply rooted. Miasma, or bad air, was feared as the carrier of all illness. If one could surround themselves with good smells, they could keep death at bay. At court, the air was thick with scent. Tapestries were sometimes soaked in floral water before being hung. Floors were strewn with herbs, chamomile, mint, sage, that released aroma when walked upon. Fires burned logs soaked in oil. Candles were made from beeswax infused with spices. Even letters were perfumed. A message carried in scented parchment conveyed not just words, but presence. The recipient would hold it to their nose before reading. Perfume was also used in the most intimate rituals. Before weddings, brides were anointed with oils. After death, bodies were covered in herbs and wrapped in scented shrouds. Perfume was both a beginning and an end. It marked celebration and mourning. It was invisible yet powerful, a signal, a symbol, a boundary between the body and the world. But it was not always welcomed. In crowded cities, the overpowering mix of smells could turn from pleasure to offence. Too much musk, and one was accused of masking sin. Too much floral scent, and it was seen as vanity. Perfume was not gendered as it is now. Men and women both wore it, but the context mattered. A knight perfumed his armour before a feast. A merchant scented his beard before a deal. But if either overstepped, he was mocked. Perfume was power, but it had to be used with control. The church too had opinions. Incense was sacred, burned during Mass, meant to purify the air and elevate the senses. But personal perfume was sometimes seen as prideful. Monks avoided it. Nuns discouraged it. Saints were said to give off sweet smells upon death, a sign of their purity. Earthly perfume, by contrast, was artificial. a mask, something to be questioned. Still, the wealthy persisted. They spent fortunes on scent, imported oils from Venice, hired apothecaries to invent new blends, commissioned artisans to design bottles shaped like animals, flowers, even tiny reliquaries. Perfume became a hidden language. A lover might recognize another by the scent left on a glove. A rival might be judged by the smell that lingered in a room after he left. The memory of a person could last longer in the nose than in the mind. Yet beneath all this, the truth remained. Perfume existed because water did not. It was a substitute, a response to the absence of cleanliness, a way to live among others without offending them, to sit in a hall of bodies and not be overwhelmed, to hide one's own scent beneath layers of something finer. Still, one wonders, did they ever stop in the stillness of a room filled with perfume and ask themselves, what would it be like to be clean without artifice? To smell of nothing, or of only the air? Or had they forgotten that there was such a thing as the scent of nothing at all? The nobleman moved through the corridor slowly, trailing a faint cloud of bergamot and resin behind him. Servants stepped aside as he passed, not because of his rank alone, but because of the way the air shifted in his wake. The scent clung to the walls, to the tapestries, to the edges of the rush-strewn floor. It announced him before he spoke, and when he was gone it lingered, a ghost in the fabric, a whisper that someone important had been there. In the world of the nobility, scent was more than personal comfort. It was performance. Rank had a smell. Wealth had a smell. Cleanliness, in its rarest form, had a smell that could be purchased, prepared, and applied. But it was always layered over something else. The smell of the body underneath. That earthy truth, sweat, digestion, breath, was ever present. No one, no matter how perfumed, was ever truly free of it. And so scent became an arms race. The more you feared being smelled for what you were, the more layers you applied. The craft of perfume was guarded by apothecaries and alchemists, men who combined ingredients by trial and error, who boiled resins, crushed blossoms, and distilled oils into dark glass vials. The work was slow. Rose oil, for example, required tens of thousands of petals for a single ounce. Ambergris, found floating in the bellies of whales, had to age in sun and salt air before its musky sweetness emerged. Civet came from a gland beneath a wild animal's tail. Musk was scraped from the dried sack of a deer. These were not gentle materials. They came from bodies, from labour, from death, and yet they were transformed into beauty. Perfume was dangerous too. Some ingredients were toxic. Lead was added to powders. Mercury was used in creams. Perfumed waters sometimes carried disease if made with spoiled alcohol or stagnant water. But knowledge was limited. If a scent made one dizzy, it was assumed to be powerful. If it burned the skin, it was judged too strong but still noble. Pain in small doses was acceptable if it led to refinement. Fashionable people did not limit their perfumes to the neck or wrists. They perfumed their hair with oils and pomades. They perfumed their shoes with sachets slipped into the toes. They perfumed their undergarments, their combs, their fans. A noble woman might carry a handkerchief steeped in violet water, pressing it to her face when passing through crowded streets or court chambers. The cloth was both shield and weapon, both filter and statement. I am not like them. I do not smell like them. I am above them. This was especially true in cities, where the smells of daily life were overwhelming. Livestock moved through the streets. Tanners boiled hides. Butchers drained blood into the gutters. Fires burned wet wood. Human waste was dumped from windows. And through this, nobles moved carefully, wrapped in carriages and cloaks, perfumed against the world. They were not immune to the city, but they pretended to be.